Welcome, everybody. This is our last concurrent session of the conference, so thank you for attending. We have two great presentations today, two presenters for the first session and one presenter for the second session. Those of you who are joining us online, I just ask that you mute your mics. And if there are questions, we kindly ask that you save them for the very end of this presentation, and we'll surely get the answers to you. So, our first session. By the way, my name is Jim Tuff. I work with CITL, Education Developer. My role is in curriculum renewal, so I may touch base with some of you over the next little while, have a new service, a little plug-in. So, our first session is titled Normalizing Pedagogical Vulnerability, a Duoethnographic Exploration of Peer Review of Teaching. And our presenters for today are Melanie Doyle, colleague at CITL, Education Developer, and Dr. Karen Dobbin-Williams, Assistant Professor of Faculty of Nursing. So I'll pass it over to you. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, folks, for joining us today to talk about peer review of teaching. I feel the need, I guess, to offer a small bit of context of that. Karen and I think, are very much in the process of putting this together still. But we are excited today to share some, I guess, our preliminary conversations around this topic. So for a little bit of background on the peer review of teaching, for anyone who might not be aware, peer review of teaching is a process where colleagues, instructors at a university review and offer feedback on one another's teaching. It's been around for quite some time, and its roots really lie in the work of Ernest Boyer from the 90s, who was trying to argue that teaching needs to have a more prominent role in higher education. We often put a lot of emphasis on research, but teaching too is an important part of our scholarly inquiry. And he proposed peer review of teaching as one way to further establish and grant recognition to teaching within an institution. So really the peer review of teaching process has a few purposes, one of which is, of course, to kind of, again, strengthen that legitimacy, perhaps, or just kind of put more attention on teaching within a higher education institute as opposed to just research, but also, and perhaps more importantly, to enhance our teaching and learning. So by going through this process of reviewing one another's teaching and granting feedback, the hope is that our teaching improves, which benefits students, of course, for whom learning is really dependent on that teaching. There's a lot of research on my own peer review of teaching. It's been shown to not only improve instructors' individual practices, but also strengthen departments and units and their kind of approach to their wider curriculum, and also bolster that kind of culture of teaching and learning within a unit or institution at large. While peer review teaching has been around for a while, it's gotten a lot more attention in the past 10 or 12 years or so, since changes to the way we kind of typically evaluate teaching have fluctuated, specifically in light of students' feedback on teaching. So for a long time, students' feedback on teaching was a very kind of common and one of the most well utilized measures of teaching effectiveness and teaching evaluation. For those at Memorial, that was often recognized by the CEQ, the Course Evaluation Questionnaire. But a lot of work has been done in the past 15 years to really highlight the inherent biases and problems within tools like the CEQ. So there's been a shift away from those sorts of instruments to measure and evaluate teaching. And instead, people have turned more towards peer review of teaching as an alternative and perhaps less biased way to evaluate teaching. So at Memorial, that shift has been happening as well. As part of our larger kind of change in how we administer the CEQ, the Senate committee had struck a special subcommittee around teaching evaluation that promoted and encouraged a more formalized process of peer review of teaching in 2021. So teaching observations and that kind of less formal versions of teaching, peer review teaching were always happening at the university, whether through CITL, an instructor might reach out to CITL to have an observation done and receive feedback. And colleagues were also working with one another to receive feedback on their teaching. But this more formalized process came into play out of this report in 2021 and was put into place in 2023. So at Memorial right now, as part of this more formal structure, potential peer reviewers are asked to complete a self-guided training module on how to be an effective reviewer, to complete the Canadian Research Chair's bias in peer review training, and to create and upload a peer reviewer profile on our website. So instructors and faculty members interested in having their teaching reviewed can contact a reviewer who kind of meets their needs. They might come from the same discipline or a different discipline. They might have, both all, teach in similar kind of context, disciplinary, undergraduate level, graduate level, or have some expertise in a specific aspect of teaching that the reviewee is interested in. Rather than assigning reviewers, this is meant to kind of offer some collegiality, which I think will be part of our practice in this over the past year. So while the process and structure is more formal, it's still meant to encourage dialogue and reflexivity to really, again, not only improve one's teaching, but to strengthen the reflective and respectful nature of teaching. So while there is growing recognition of peer review locally and within the larger contexts, it's still problematic at times. There's some research kind of pointing to these. It's time consuming for all parties involved. It can be perceived as, and maybe perhaps in actuality, kind of serve some institutional agendas that don't always feel authentic to an instructor's goals and practices. And it can feel intimidating or intrusive, especially for the instructors being reviewed. But in light of that, it is still widely recognized as an acceptable and positive practice. Perhaps most notably, it is acknowledged in the Canadian Association of University Teachers teaching dossier template, which is what Memorial uses as their guide for the promotion and tenure process. So it's highly valuable in that way, in the way we measure and evaluate teaching, despite these problems. So Karen and I both took part in this process over the fall semester. Karen reached out to me to have her teaching reviewed, which is where this work came from today. And we found the process to be deeply valuable for all the reasons kind of described here, not only for Karen's teaching, but as for myself as the reviewer. But despite those benefits, it was still uncomfortable at times. We felt discomfort and uncertainty in different ways. And rather than just kind of let that lie, we decided to tease it out a little bit, which is what we want to share to you today, and where this kind of duoethnographic approach comes in. So we wanted to ask, how might duoethnography or this kind of reflective dialogue-based approach help us better understand our experiences of this peer review teaching process? So I'm going to pass it over to Karen to talk more about our methodology.
Well, thanks, everyone. So the goal of duoethnography is to disrupt and untangle one's own assumptions that you bring to the research through critical self-study in an attempt to change your perspective, feel understood, and understand others better through engagement with another participant in dialogue. Duoethnography requires the participants to move alternately backward via autobiographical reflection, so reflect on yourself, sideways by considering new perspectives, so mine and Melanie's shared perspectives, and your previous understandings, and then forward through some transformation resulting from your previous explorations. It was first described by Norris and Sawyer in 2003, and they were sociologists who were looking at gender identity and sexual identity. And when they were exploring this and trying to find a methodology that suited their discussions and their explorations of sexual identity and gender identity, they came up with duoethnography. So what duoethnography is, the researchers are simultaneously participants. And in a lot of our research, we are participants within our research. We can't just hold our own thoughts and feelings and experiences to the side. So it's meaningful, thoughtful engagement in conversational dialogue. And that's exactly how it started between Melanie and I. And I'll unfold some of the process that we went through now shortly. So there has to be a mutual interest in a social phenomenon, a common experience, and you use description, stories to share your lived experiences. So those are your narratives. You question meanings of the past within yourselves and each other. We're not trying to seek a universal truth that's going to be true for everyone. This is true of our experience in this time with our own background, history, culture, experiences, age, gender, all those things. There's a lot of ethics involved in this and a lot of trust to allow the disclosure. I had to trust Melanie and she had to trust me. We weren't just sort of strangers coming to this and saying, oh yeah, let's have a difficult conversation about this. So respect and compassion is needed because you're uncovering some uncomfortable things about yourself. And transformation and building connection is really, really important. And I feel like we did that so well in the process. I was so delighted with this whole process. So in terms of the beginning and the unfolding of duoethnography, it starts as a casual conversation, which it sort of did for us. And it moves to an unearthing of assumptions, lived experiences, feelings about things. And it's often related to something nagging that you're like, yeah, you gave me my peer review of teaching. And for Melanie, yeah, I gave it to you, but there's something that's still troubling us about this. So through our dialogue, you share your experiences verbally. You can record them, which we did at points. And you can write them, which we also did at points and shared them with each other. And it's reciprocal, back and forth, back and forth. We named our emotions. We named our deeply held assumptions about teaching, learning, hierarchy, tenure track, things like that. And nonverbal cues are noticed. So when Melanie and I did it, we did it virtually over WebEx. You also bring, and this brings in the trustworthiness of the data, you bring in archived materials, artifacts, emails, text messages, social media, recordings, audio notes, artwork, academic articles. So it's not just two people in conversation sharing their opinions. You know, it is a rigorous process. So there's multiple voices in the dialogue besides the two human voices. So creating the new meaning, that's the data analysis. So what you do is all these pieces of data, maybe it's recordings, maybe it's social media, maybe it's text back and forth. You mine all of those for general themes and interpretations to answer that research question and make meaning. And of course, our research question is how might we understand the process of peer review and teaching and how it basically affected us, our experience with it. So these then get highlighted and discussed further. Those themes that we first came up with, they're co-constructed. It's not just my ideas, it's not just Melanie's ideas, it's a sharing of ideas. And then the dialogue just naturally tapers. And that happened for us. We were like, yeah, I think we've covered it. Are you good? I'm good. And that back and forth. And how we invite others into the dialogue, which is important, is through dissemination. And that's one of the things, obviously, we're doing today. And also we will be doing that in the form of a manuscript. So how do we ensure trustworthiness within this methodological approach? Well, it's found in self-reflexivity and believability. And I'm hoping that at the end of this session, you're going to be like, I can believe that they came up with those themes. I can believe that that was their experience. And we have to be transparent to be trustworthy. I can't say some things and not other things. A literature review, very important. So, you know, we've done a literature review now on peer review and teaching because that is one of the interactive voices in this research, and it is an integral part to the conversation to make it trustworthy. Most trustworthy projects, of course, grow out of existing relationships. It already has a basis in familiarity and trust, but duoethnographers, we have to bring some distinctive differences to the exploration. We're not the same people. We don't teach in the same faculty. We don't have the same educational background, for example. So I'm a nursing professor of 20 years, and I was being peer reviewed. I have been teaching pathophysiology for 20 plus years. I've had the course evaluation questionnaires. I've had students fill out things. I've had my peers within nursing come and evaluate me. But I wanted something different. And the something different was bringing an English instructor professor, an educational developer, which is what Melanie is, to it as my peer reviewer. So this brought up some feelings for us that sort of came out as our themes. So in terms of our experience with duoethnography of the peer review of teaching, this is available to all instructors, faculty members within Memorial University of Newfoundland. Melanie was the reviewer, I was the reviewee. Melanie observed 2 of my classes in the fall semester. She had access to my course website on bright space. She reviewed my course syllabus, my PowerPoint slides, my class objectives. She came and she observed my classes. She sat in the back and she was very unobtrusive. But of course, the learners, the students who were in the room, they knew she was there. And I was like, please let them be, you know, interested and engaged. But she did notice some things, which was really helpful for me. So after she observed the classes, she reviewed the documents, she gave the feedback, then we had a debrief. So she sent this review to me, and then we had a debrief then in early January. And we realized then at that point that we wanted to talk about that process and, you know, to use the term to unpack it a bit more. So we had an unofficial conversation the first time. We each wrote a narrative, and that was Melanie's suggestion. She said, why don't we both each write about what our experience was and send it to each other, which we did. We shared our narratives, we discussed our narratives, and then we recorded a conversation that we had about our narratives and more feelings about the process. And from that was recorded, it was transcribed, we reviewed literature about peer review, and then we analyzed those documents to come up with the themes and beginning interpretations. So we came up with 3 broad themes. And as Melanie said at the beginning, we're going through this process now. So it will evolve, but we want to share some of what we've come up with so far.
Sure. Thanks, Karen. So this first theme that's come out of our data to date is around collegial conversations and really about centering collegiality in this peer review process. So on these slides, you'll see kind of some various quotes that are mostly been pulled from our narratives and from our conversations and the other data we've collected. I apologize for that the text is fairly small, but we'll kind of talk through them in some detail. So this theme of collegial conversation really centers, I think, our shared belief that came from our conversations that peer review of teaching works best when it's rooted in this mutual respect. So although it has some roots as a process, as a means of evaluation, we discovered some tension with this idea of it as an evaluative process. For me as the reviewer, I really found myself reflecting on how that evaluative language kind of came into friction with my own beliefs about teaching and learning and my own approach to reviewing Karen. So at the same time as I was trying to kind of untangle that, I was also trying to kind of place it onto one side because I felt like it was the job I had to do as a reviewer. And it wasn't until much later that we realized that we were both kind of feeling some of that tension and wanted to lean on that collegiality more than the evaluative nature that some might approach this process from. So we had discussed how our assumptions about the roles, especially in relation to our individual roles as instructors, my role as an educational developer, can potentially undermine that collegial spirit if we let it. If we get caught up in these hierarchies, if we try to who is a peer and who is not. So all of these questions that were kind of nagging at us individually at times could have undermined the collegiality that we found to be so important. But through unpacking this further, as Karen said, we were able to kind of center that collegiality, that mutual trust, that respect that we found to be so integral to the process. So from Karen's perspective, that came out of her narrative in our discussions, one of the highlights, I guess, of this collegiality that we were able to center was a recognition that we were both benefiting from this process. So in a lot of the literature on peer review of teaching, the focus is on the benefits of the individual instructor, the instructor being reviewed. You learn, you get feedback on your teaching, and that might benefit you as an instructor, it might benefit your program. But through my narrative, I also described how it would benefit me as the reviewer. And that was really novel information, Karen, that we were able to kind of highlight that reciprocity, I guess, and that it was a mutually benefiting relationship when we centered those values that were core to us as individuals. So I think through this theme, there's a challenge there to institutions and to potential peer reviewers to see this peer review process as not just a checklist, as something to add to a P&T file, but as a way for sharing reflections to highlight mutual growth in a way that really centers that collegiality. All right. The second theme is around vulnerability. As Karen described, about that, please behave when someone in the room, it's vulnerable to invite someone into your classroom in that way. Teaching often feels, at least, sometimes for me, as something you do on your own. You're often teaching alone, even though you're in these programs, you have your colleagues, your curriculum lends into other programs and other courses, but you're often there kind of by yourself at times. So inviting another person in to witness that vulnerability can be challenging. And through my role as the reviewer, I found myself, not unexpectedly perhaps, but reflecting on my own feelings of how I've been reviewed in the past. So I was very aware of that vulnerability necessary, and it helped me approach the review process with maybe a level of empathy that I think was really useful to the process. So I began reflecting on my own teaching practices, my own practices and experience of being reviewed. And this is, I think, where some of that mutual benefit came into play, because I was not only trying to assess Karen's ability, but I was constantly aware of my own approach too, and how what I was observing might be reflected back to myself, and so on and so forth. The other aspect of that was, I think, highly vulnerable for me as the reviewer was my kind of dual role as an educational developer with CITL, but also my role as a per course instructor with Department of English. I've been teaching in English since 2017. And I often, in every aspect in some ways, kind of struggle with these dualities at times of figuring which hat am I coming at a topic from today? So, am I taking off one hat, putting on another, and so on and so forth. So I'm not on the tenure track. I'm not in that position. So to be approached as a peer, it led to a lot of kind of doubt and questioning about myself. So opening up to Karen about that, I think kind of added an extra layer to our discussion that was useful for both of us. It's okay. Yeah. Okay. Is it
5 minutes?
okay.
Minutes. Perfect.
All right. So the theme of being vulnerable is, important for all aspects, both in relates to your teaching itself as a vulnerable practice of inviting people in, and for the reviewer as well. And I think if we kind of don't confront that, it can really be a potential barrier to completing or participating in peer review, because it does require some level of letting your guard down.
So the final one, imposter syndrome, and this is something that maybe a lot of people experience, and certainly Melanie and I, when we were speaking about it, we uncovered imposter syndrome. So just going to read a couple of quotes just to sort of see how we develop this theme, and it's going to be, like I said, something more broad. So for Melanie, I was not necessarily seen as a peer, these are her words, but someone with perceived, and she used the word perceived expertise related to teaching and learning. Importantly, all instructors for whom I've completed an observation or the more formalized peer review have been tenure track, whereas I teach on a sessional basis. At least in that regard, I'm not a peer. To me, this was mind-blowing, because I was like, but you're an educational developer. You are doing your PhD in education, you have a master's in English, you know all this. So that was really mind-boggling to me, that she could potentially feel like an imposter. And then mine was, I'll just go the fourth quote down. I named it. I said, it's imposter syndrome, I think. As I was reading through yours and I was talking about the written piece, I was like, I felt like, yeah, you know what? She had some imposter syndrome like I do. Because when I was reading what you were writing, I thought, yeah, she's, we had so many similar things. You were with when yours was the first time your teaching was observed, did you speak slowly enough? Were your students engaged? Would they contribute? Those were the same things. So that imposter syndrome, and we talk about it a lot in academia, and it doesn't matter if you have been a nurse for 30 plus years, a professor for 20 plus years like I have, or whether it's been a short period of time, we all experience some of this imposter syndrome. And for that to come out in the peer review of teaching was kind of surprising to me as a theme. Will I do the conclusion? Yeah. Okay, so peer review in teaching can encourage dialogue about teaching and strengthen faculty relationships. I highly recommend it. But you are going to feel vulnerable. It may bring up some imposter syndrome, But I think you need to choose your peer reviewer carefully. And I had the privilege of meeting Melanie this summer because I did sessions that CITL was offering about doing a teaching dossier that Melanie was facilitating. And I got to know her as funny, easygoing, kind,
Never been
considerate.
funny before.
She was hilarious. But it was a really open collegial thing when we did it in the summer. And I was like, she would be great. Plus, she's an English instructor, so she's going to know the stuff. So in terms of having it done yourself, our narratives do expose the ways in which imposter syndrome can manifest in both the reviewer and the reviewee, and it has the potential to erode your confidence. I don't feel like my confidence was eroded, but I have learned so much from the process. So when it was framed instead as a collaborative conversation rather than an evaluation, it can build your confidence, it can normalize your vulnerability, and it can inspire faculty to embrace innovative teaching practices. And just off the cuff, I'd like to share a couple of things that I had never thought of, because I thought I was doing it all that I could do in pathophysiology. I got the gamification, I got the TikToks, I got the YouTube, I got all the different things. But one thing that, I'll just give you an example that Melanie noticed, she was like, Karen, when you say to the class, anyone have any questions? Any questions? Does anyone have any questions? No one asks the question. But she said, if you just say something simple like, what was the muddiest point today? That's going to engage the students. They're going to say, well, Karen, the muddiest point was when you talked about pH balance and blah, blah, blah. I was like, oh my goodness. Another thing she suggested was, when she was watching me from the back of the room, there was a few students on their computers shopping or on social media or whatever. And she suggested to me, she said, why don't you have a technology-free area in your classroom where it could be just a little section, and the people who are, interrupted or bothered by people typing or on the computers or whatever, they can sit there. I have those things now in intercession, and lots of other suggestions that she made. So it was so, so valuable. So I really appreciated that. And anyone who's listened to me that I've had the opportunity to speak about it, I've spoken very highly of this peer review of teaching. So this is basically, this is a QR code if you want to contact us. And I know that our slides will be shared after. And if anyone has any questions, we'd be thrilled to answer them.
So the QR code will bring you to the peer review teaching website, not to.
That's right. That's right. But you can still contact us for questions. Or if you have any now, we'd be happy to answer them.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Any questions?
Just a comment. I've been, sorry, somebody else would.
You go ahead.
Just peer reviews are something I've always been interested in, but it's never occurred to me to have somebody outside my own discipline. So that, I think, is fascinating.
Yeah.
And something that I'm quite interested in learning more about. So thank you for just introducing me to that. That's a possibility.
Excellent. Good.
Thanks for that presentation, and very interested in this, of course. I guess they talk about the imposter syndrome and the relationship. I guess we're almost never actually peers, and in terms of the relationship between the reviewer and the review. Sometimes like you have not tenure track to tenure track, you have tenured professors versus non-tenured, tenure track professors, or you might have a department head or somebody in this. I look at myself as a peer reviewer. I have a role in the P&T process, so I'm certainly not. There's a different view, or there's going to be a different assessment of what I say. I guess my question is, how do we work with that, and what do we do to get around that, to make it as close as we can with what we're looking for, which is a true peer?
That's a good question. If you free to add to this in any way or disagree with me. I don't know if it's something we need to get around or away from. I don't know. It's not a bad thing necessarily, as long as I think you can kind of recognize it, name it, sit with those feelings, whether they're uncomfortable or not, and then live with them. I don't think, we are different people. We're all different people and have those different roles. But I think there's a strength to that discomfort as long as we can recognize it and are willing to grapple with it.
And I think for me too, and as you said, there's power differentials in whatever you encounter in life. And I think what made me feel comfortable is that I had met Melanie before, because I looked at the list of reviewers. I looked at what faculties they were from, and I was like, who's going to understand my approach? Not necessarily the content that I was teaching, because we're different content experts, but who was going to understand my approach better? So what Melanie did before we even started the process is she had a meeting with me. And we had a conversation, and, she's like, this is what I bring to it. And I'm like, yeah, this is what, I bring to it. So we sort of broke the ice that way. And I think that was really helpful, because if I had just filled out the formative assessment forms and sent them to her, and she showed up at my class, and we didn't have any previous relationship as reviewer and reviewee, the research aside, I think it would have been a lot more uncomfortable. Whereas she had broken that ice by having the meeting and by me attending sessions she had already done. So I think, and that's, because you're an educational developer, that opportunity was there. But I think if it's just faculty in two different faculties, I think having a preliminary meeting and saying, is this person going to be a good fit for me? I think is important.
So having a part where you become peers as a part of the process?
Absolutely. Kind of.
So the personal relationship is actually quite important here.
That's what peers are.
Definitely. That's right. That is a pair, is having that relationship. Yeah. Even though we're totally different people and different points in our careers and trajectories. Yeah.
Melanie, do you see yourself as a peer now?
Oh, no. Well, it's funny, you mentioned like going through the list of reviewers. It wasn't until like after when we wrote those narratives and shared them and through our discussion where I realized that's how Karen came across my name. I didn't believe in a million years someone would look at the list and choose me out of it. I thought it was just because she knew me from CITL. And I will likely still believe that the next time someone contacts me. That's just
Karen sent me. That's what it is. But I think too, the respect for English and education. My father was a teacher and an administrator, and so I've always had a high level of respect for those two faculties. Because she's on phone. Yeah, you were.
Just
See, she's.
Can you have a question?
Yeah, I'm just interested in number one, what prompted you to do this together? I find it very interesting because I didn't really, I know about the peer review of teaching and part of that process of, brought about at Memorial, but as I'm listening to you, like we call it the peer review of teaching, that's almost intimidating within itself, the labels that we give things, and it's based upon the process versus the relationship. So like, what value does the work you've done inform how we can move this forward? I think there's a number of barriers here that we face with the adoption of this process. And largely one is that, I only think of peers in my own discipline, right? Versus thinking about going and thinking about somebody else in another discipline, that thinking about my teach versus my own discipline, Yeah, I don't know if that makes any sense. Anyways, I'm just curious as to what your thoughts are, how we inform this, the process itself going forward.
Yeah, I think there's.
We don't call it a process, a relationship. Yeah.
No, you raised a few good points. I've just from my own, I put my work hat back on. Like I thought of kind of scaffolded approaches that can kind of be built in around this, almost to lead to the peer review. So to help someone maybe be more comfortable in approaching someone to have their teaching peer reviewed, like what can come first to kind of help develop some of that confidence and the comfort to even reach out. Something maybe even like a kind of teaching square sort of setup, or there are other ways that maybe I think can lay some of that foundation for people to feel more comfortable and even engaging with the process. And your first question around like kind of what brought this on initially, I think it was that when we met, the way I wanted to structure it against kind of my own values was around, instead of just kind of sending Karen like pages and pages of the documents I had kind of created through the review, I sent some of them to her so she had time to digest, and then we met to debrief and kind of unpack it before I sent her the kind of final letter, I'll say. And it was through that debrief where we realized that we kind of still had some of those nagging moments. And for me, they mostly came from the documentation around the process. So we have, forms created that like Senate approved, or I'm not super familiar with the whole process, around formative reviews and summative reviews, and a lot of the language on them, I'm really stifling. Like I needed more space to like sing Karen's praises, and I found myself adding blocks to the forms so I could do that. And of course, there's no reason not to do that. And it says, you know, adapt these as you will, and so on and so forth. But I really found myself needing to make those changes to highlight Karen the way I felt she should be highlighted, to allow space for me to emphasize the things that I value. And so it was a lot of that, those changes that I felt were necessary, I think, were my nagging feelings that I think through our debrief and explaining the changes we made is where this conversation began.
Yeah. I know we're out of time.
All good?
Yes, thank you.
Just, okay, so our second presentation today is by Lynn Kendall, who's an assistant professor in business administration in the School of Arts and Social Science, Brentford. So welcome to St. John's campus.
Thank you.
Yes. Her topic is titled Indigenizing Business Education, Transforming Teaching for Reconciliation. You will take questions during your presentation, you said?
During or after.
Awesome. So if you do have questions online, just put them in the chat. We're monitoring you here. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks everybody. Happy to be here. First, I'm going to start my presentation with just a few maybe definitions or concepts of words that some of you may have heard over the last number of years, just truth, reconciliation, indigenization, decolonization. What do all these words mean? Well, you've probably heard truth and reconciliation often together in the same concept or in the same conversation. And in 2008, then Prime Minister Stephen Harper issued an apology to the survivors of Indian residential schools who for close to a century had been, or actually more than a century, had been forcibly removed from their homes and forced into church-run schools where there was any number of untold harms as a result. So survivors had been for quite a while looking for an apology and some restitution for the damage that was done to their lives and their lives of their communities. So Prime Minister Harper issued a formal apology and then established a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And the TRC had two basic mandates. One was to hear the truth telling from the survivors of the residential school systems, and then to produce a report of their findings and to develop some means of how the government could provide restitution and reconcile with the Indigenous people who were victims of the residential schools. So from that, and I'll talk a little bit more about TRC in a later slide, but from that conversation, we then developed ideas of indigenization and decolonization. So when we talk about indigenization, what we're really saying is that we want to see Indigenous voices, concepts, ideas, knowledge included in whatever conversation is happening. And in the context that I'll be talking about today, that context is within the business school curriculum at the post-secondary level. So it's just the inclusion of those Indigenous ideals and concepts. Decolonization, on the other hand, and I'm going to tell you first what decolonization is not. And this is basically what I heard from a keynote address by the Honorable Murray Sinclair who was the chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. He delivered a keynote a few years ago at a conference I was attending. He said, decolonization is not us wanting to return to living in teepees. So that's not what it is. But it's actually the dismantle and the challenging and the removal of structures, that colonial structures that have been in place for centuries that have caused the harm to Indigenous communities. So again, we'll talk, decolonization will come into my presentation a little bit later. But it's essentially, it's just undoing the harm of colonization. So Margaret Kovach is an Indigenous scholar, and she advocates for positioning Indigenous scholars to position themselves in relation to their research. So I'm just going to talk for a few minutes, something I'm not comfortable about talking about myself, is that I am of mixed Mi'kmaq and European settler ancestry. I grew up in El Mastagwek, also commonly known as the Bay of Islands, just outside Corner Brook. I have my Mi'kmaq heritage from both my father and mother side of the family. I'm also a chartered professional accountant, which also seems a bit of a dissonance between being a Mi'kmaq scholar and a CPA. And this is what I actually teach in the business program is accounting and some finance. So in my reflection, in my self-location, I over the years of working within the academy, I have had to kind of reflect upon how I bridge these two sides of my world, of my Mi'kmaq ancestry and heritage, and my profession as a chartered professional accountant. Accounting has often been pointed out as a very colonial profession, one that has been the cause and the root of much of the harm, especially from an economic harm to Indigenous peoples. So I, have to now relate those two concepts of my being. So basically, how I've been able to connect those two world sides of myself is that I've used my profession to help my community. So whether that is as a volunteer, for 8 years, I was up until recently, I completed my second term as the vice chair of my band, Hollywood First Nation, their finance and audit committee. I've spoken at many events within my community to offer advice as also a business owner, from a financial perspective, from a business entrepreneurial perspective. I'm often called upon to offer these type of conversations. And as a result, I've been able to assist my community and help my community in that regard. In my location, because this is a teaching presentation, I also have developed my knowledge as a chartered professional accountant and my heritage as a Mi'kmaq in my teaching. So in the next few slides, I'm going to talk about how we can indigenize some of the problems we have with the academy and business schools, and how we can indigenize and even potentially decolonize business schools. I promised another brief conversation about Truth and Reconciliation Canada. So in 2015, the TRC delivered their final report, and in the report included 94 calls to action that compels all facets of Canadian life to Canadian society to reconcile with Indigenous peoples: health, justice, education, child welfare, government, language, and culture. Universities specifically are called out to engage in reconciliation research in particular. And SSHRC, some of us are probably familiar with SSHRC, was specifically mentioned in the report as well as to provide grants to fund reconciliation research. And over the years, this year will mark the 10 years of the TRC final report. And over this 10 years, the reconciliation conversation has broadened to more than just what was reported as a result of the residential school, but to include other aspects of Canadian society. So on perspectives on Indigenization, so when we talk about Indigenizing the business curriculum, I want to first talk about what Bastian et al. Talks about is cosmetic Indigenization. And that's basically tokenism, maybe a land acknowledgement. Maybe in business school, we love our case studies, including a case study of that involves an Indigenous individual or business. So that's really tokenism, but it's not truly Indigenization. It might make them feel good and make them feel that this is something that they're doing, but this is kind of at one end of the spectrum. And on the other end is decolonial Indigenization. And that's where we really look at how the university can be fundamentally transformed to dismantle those structures that prevent Indigenous, whether it be students, Indigenous scholars, Indigenous teachers, Indigenous communities, to succeed within this environment. So we've got a broad spectrum of Indigenization. So what I call the flawed academy is some of the issues that are generally discussed about with regard to the challenges that Indigenous people, again, be students, scholars, communities face when dealing with universities. One is that many of them are located on unceded land. So most of the land that universities are on in Canada have not been, and in other nations, the United States, those others who have been victims of settler colonialism, such as New Zealand and Australia as well. These lands were never agreed to be provided for this purpose. So, certainly in Grenfell campus, we are located on unceded lands. We're also, most of what we teach and what we research is grounded in very Eurocentric epistemologies and pedagogies. So, and as a result, devalues Indigenous knowledge. So Indigenous knowledges are not seen as rigorous or as in that hierarchy of knowledge. Of course, the Western-centric knowledge is at the summit, and Indigenous knowledges would be considered much lower, what some scholars would call cognitive imperialism. And because of the roots in Western pedagogy and epistemology, the curriculum that universities develop are also follow that same pattern of Westernization or Eurocentric viewpoints. And even into the whole culture of the university, the administration of the university, the structures, the policies, pretty much everything about the university is based upon these Eurocentric ideals. So much Indigenous knowledge has been used by the Academy over the years. Many of it has been extracted or appropriated for their own purposes. Research in particular has been identified as certainly a very precarious situation for Indigenous people. Indigenous people were often the subjects of research that they didn't know that they were a part of, or that they weren't asked to be a part of. The data was never provided back to them. A lot of it were in medicine, for example. The whole thing of blood quantums and so far is very problematic in Indigenous worlds. So a lot of their Indigenous knowledges have been extracted from their communities and never returned, or has been misappropriated and has been attached to European style, Western style scholarship. One question within business schools that has been often discussed is this theory of Maslow's and his hierarchy of needs. Some of you may have seen this or heard this in maybe in your education. Of course, a very famous theory that's used across many disciplines, but certainly in business. Well, there is some evidence that Maslow actually may have co-opted that concept from the Blackfoot Confederacy in Alberta, with whom he lived with for a period of time. They have a very similar type of concept. So again, very problematic when Indigenous knowledges are being extracted from.
He flipped it upside down.
Flip it upside down, it is.
Giving the knowledge even further. Community is at the top
Yes.
of the hierarchy of needs.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Ivan. So these things we don't know. So essentially what some scholars have said is that the university is just an extension of the settler project. Business schools in particular, anybody here else teach or knowledge of business school? Okay, interesting. So we know that we teach, that profit maximization. Milton Friedman's good ideas that our goal in business is to maximize the profit for the shareholders. That is our focus. We reinforce the hegemony of the market economy. So this capitalistic ideals are what we primarily promote. The accreditation process itself, many business schools are accredited, but that has a very strict standard, and it doesn't allow for a lot of the more indigenized concepts, courses, methods of assessment, and so on to be brought in so the schools can maintain their accreditation. In business, we're taught to strive for individual success, not community success. That's very opposite to the Indigenous community, where community success comes before individual success, which is what Ivan mentioned about the inverse of Maslow's hierarchy. Case studies, we know we love them in business. We use them in a lot of different courses. And Rennick and Salmon did an interesting study where they examined studies from Ivy Business School and Harvard Business School, which where a lot of our case studies we originate, about how many involve Indigenous topics, themes, protagonists, and so on. A very small percentage, less than 1%. But those that did, there were some issues with them. One is that there was always often a white savior approach. So a business is coming in to help an Indigenous community or a group of Indigenous people for solve some problem. A lot of what we see in these case studies is that there's a decision, a problem that needs to be solved. Some of these cases had the Indigenous people on the periphery, not necessarily as the main actors in the case studies. Some cases there show that there was very proud Indigenous leader who went away, got educated somewhere, came back to the community, and which is all good to elevate that there are successes within the community, but it then shows that there is this departure that perhaps the leaders had to go away from their community to come back to be respected. So they did find that over the spectrum of the last 15, 20 years of these case studies, the older ones are really problematic and we don't want to have anything to do with them. There have been some written in the last few years that are pretty good, that are pretty safe, and they should be relied upon, but we need more of that. From a business perspective, when we look at things such as when settlers first arrived in Canada, they engaged in the fur trade, and then the Hudson Bay Company developed a monopoly so that if you wanted to trade, it had to go through the Hudson Bay Company. Hudson Bay Company introduced the first currency in Canada. Many of the Euro settlers, many of the the Indigenous communities have matrilineal traditions. So women were elevated to higher positions, and they had equal standing as men. But of course, when the European settlers arrived, they're not doing business with women. So Indigenous women were sidelined, and they would only trade with the men. And then eventually, as settler population grew, the Indigenous people were sidelined. They weren't hired, they weren't engaged with, so then it became a dominant settler society. And so many of the historical wrongs that have been occurred as a result of settler colonialism, it has been because of economics and the business that has been transpired. So I just got this little chart here. How much time do I have left? 6 minutes. Okay. All right. Okay. So just very, very quickly, I've listed here some aspects that I feel that how we can indigenize our business schools through content, teaching methods, changing our institution and goals for the ultimate goal of indigenization versus decolonization. Indigenization, essentially, we want to see the inclusion of Indigenous knowledges, Indigenous peoples in the business curriculum. To decolonize, we want to see the removal of Eurocentric and ideals and indigenized ideals put in its place. This is a circular kind of format. In order to decolonize, we have to indigenize. And once we decolonize, then that is essentially indigenization. So there is this circular format. So I could go into, I've got a bunch of notes on that, but I'm running out of time. So I'm going to just focus specifically on business curriculum. So here's my thoughts. To include Indigenous worldviews and topics of reconciliation. Okay, it's just so that we know that there are alternate worldviews than European or Western views. Talk about reconciliation, why this needs to be done. It's important that everybody knows why reconciliation is first. Incorporate Indigenous models and practices. Just give the Blackfoot Confederacy co-credit when you're teaching Maslow. Or teach something like the 7 generations teaching. We think about immediate success, how we're going to turn the profit for the next year or the next 2 years. What about the 7 generations in our society, our our environment. What is our impacts of our business and management decisions upon the 7 generations? I mentioned the safe and appropriate case studies. Of course, we need to work on that, and we need to develop more and write more case studies that have Indigenous protagonists, but also where the Indigenous voices are really heard and not just sidelined. Invite knowledge holders and elders in to share their knowledge, and of course, make sure they're compensated appropriately for their knowledge. Engage in land-based learnings. This is more of an experiential type of learning process. Include alternate forms of assessment, things like storytelling. So if you're if you're asking students to write an essay to explain something, that can be a piece of art, that can be a story that then explains the concept. So it doesn't have to be, there's alternate ways of demonstrating knowledge. Again, truth and reconciliation is important. So important I mentioned there twice. But that was a late night mistake, I think. Create a standalone Indigenous themed course. And if I get a minute, I'm going to talk very briefly about a course I developed, and hire and equally important, support Indigenous faculty. We can come into to the academy with not much comfort around us in terms of people who are in our schools or even in our campuses that working on the same types of things that we're working on, and it seems a little bit foreign. And if we're trying to indigenize the academy, what does that mean? Fortunately, I have very supportive colleagues, and they're constantly looking at ways that they can support me in my initiatives, but also our students, not only Indigenous students, but non-Indigenous students as well. So in the last section, I did develop a course titled Issues in Indigenous Business. And the purpose of this course was to inform students about how the colonial concept of, pre-contact Indigenous economic systems, the current situation, and how we came from where we are to where we began. And I wrote some case studies that I used myself. We use concepts. We look at specific rushing now, so I'm losing my train of thought, where we learn specific sectors such as tourism, oil and gas, fisheries, and so on, where we have significant Indigenous participation. So some of my reflections of what the students came out of. I've taught the course twice now. Students are interested and respectful. It's not that I didn't think that they wouldn't be, but you kind of never know when you're doing something different. These are students typically in their 3rd or 4th year, that there may be some issues. Absolutely not. They were interested. Attendance was pretty good for most people. There's a couple that, there was always an issue, but when they came, they were prepared to be engaged and to talk. When I teach that course, I like to teach in a circular format. They were like, well, this is a little bit weird for me. As business students, we're always teaching in we've got the tiered classrooms or what. So at first they were not receptive to that, but eventually I'd come into the classroom. There's one classroom that I used that just had tables and chairs so they could move around. They would be already had furniture moved, ready for the circular format. So they got used to that. They were resistant to the alternate forms of assessment. I got no stories, I got no videos, I got no artwork. So, and again, because after 3 or 4 years of being essays and Excel spreadsheets and so on, no, they hadn't yet bought into the idea that there was another way that they could test their knowledge. I was warned early on, when the very first class, I teach implicit bias. I was warned very early on, I don't think I should do that in the first class. That's going to make people uncomfortable. I said, well, that's okay. So I taught it. And in a final reflection, the majority of students in the final reflection said that I didn't realize there was such a thing as implicit bias. I didn't know I had implicit biases. Thank you. And now I'm able to recognize when I have these thoughts or these impressions of people or situations or objects. So they were actually grateful that was the first thing that they were introduced to in the course. So that's it. I know it was fast and I didn't get into as much details, but Lalio, thank you for this time. And if there's a question or two that I can quickly answer.
Yeah, so we'll open it up for questions. Any questions on the floor first? Any questions from anybody online? Oh, Kim has a question? Yes, sorry. Go ahead.
Just anybody online who already has.
Nobody's typing anything in the chat, so we'll stick with that.
I don't know what my question is. I find this really intriguing and interesting and they reconcile those. That's difficult discipline, I know, because coming from my own same discipline, especially accounting, finance, these structures that are in place, they're very colonial. But I on the end of it, was that a course? That was a specific course you assigned?
Yes.
Or around, okay.
Let's look at the historical and current context, some of the issues involved in Indigenous business, and then I go into sector-specific weeks on, so fisheries, big one would have been the Clearwater acquisition by Mi'kmaq Coalition a couple of years ago, which is, a huge case for the fisheries.
I think of new doc.
What's that?
I think of new doc too.
And new doc that will be in my next.
So how does that reconcile, like you say, with accreditation processes and things like that? Where is it built into that as well in the?
Well, our business program, we're not accredited under the same program that Faculty of Business is.
Right.
So we're not held to that same issue.
That's the standard, but it's not.
Yeah, so we don't, so when it comes to assessments and that assurance of learning, whether that's typically, like I said, it could be a paper, presentation. I've been trying to encourage students to create a story, create a piece of art somehow. They haven't bought it yet.
Do you still feel like you're fitting indigenization into a colonial structure when you do this? Like I find it hard to understand what it looks like to indigenize curriculum.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
especially in this discipline, but we're trying to understand, I guess, what that feels like, it looks like. Do you feel vulnerable doing it?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. For sure. Fortunately, like I said, I've got a supportive colleagues, and they've encouraged me to develop this course. They would like to see it offered every year, at least once a year, because they feel that students should be taking it. But students have been very receptive to the 2 times that I've offered it, and they're, as I said, they're respectful, they're interested. Bringing in Indigenous knowledges. We've had guest speakers. I had a chief in my classroom in one day to talk about the United Nations Declaration. There's that right on the rights of Indigenous people. I bring in, or I've taken them to presentations by Mi'kmaq cultural leaders. Of course, we have a large Mi'kmaq population on the West Coast, so sometimes trying not to be so, and of course, along with Ivan, we're both Mi'kmaq people and members of Hollywood First Nation, but we don't, I wanted to make sure that other nations are represented as well. But that sometimes that's difficult when, you have your own community. So, but, talking about the 7 generations teaching, I see that as pretty basic in business for, like in accounting, we talked about the financial benefits. But there's also social benefits, community benefits, environmental benefits. So all these things can be introduced into accounting curriculum. It can be introduced into strategy. It can be introduced into if there's courses in social entrepreneurship. So there are other ways that Indigenous knowledges can be brought in. And in accounting, I know we've got to teach, we've got also, in addition to our, you're accredited, but we've also got those CPA guidelines that we have to adhere to, right? Because we've got these frameworks, these agreements with CPA Atlantic, where we have to teach basically their curriculum in order for our students to get their equivalency if they wanted to complete a CPA afterwards. So I know that I have that. So This is a dissonance I have, right, in my accounting course, which is part of the reason why I wanted to develop a standalone course. If I taught strategy or some other course where I could bring in more Indigenous concepts, that might make it a little bit easier. Sorry.
Yeah, and so I teach in engineering, so very, very interested in this. And I've struggled, frankly, quite a bit with how we go about decolonizing and indigenization in engineering education. You know, we're strongly accredited, and our accreditation standards are looking for those sorts of things. But frankly, they're mostly looking for it in a cosmetic sense, because they don't know. The systems don't know. They're colonial systems. They don't know how to indigenize. And I'm frankly struggling.
They don't. The colonial systems will not have any part in indigenization. They just react to dismantling themselves. And Indigenous people are the only people who indigenize.
Right. And so, and then this, I guess this is the challenge, is that, you know, we struggle with, you know, if I'm teaching first year circuits, I'm thinking, okay, how can I even think of it? How can I even begin to think?
It's like first year surveys?
Circuit.
Oh, circuits, I think it's survey.
Electricity, right? Like you talk electricity or about calculus or about, you know, software design. These sorts of things is really challenging for me to see where I can put. And of course, as a settler, I don't have the background we
Right.
do it.
And the entire system is set up so you wouldn't have a background, because any technology or any development that Indigenous people have done is locked in the past.
Right. Yeah. So it's it's action. So it's a real challenge. But I guess my question for you is, and one of the things I've struggled with, you know, as an academic administrator, is I'm reluctant to encourage add-ons because it leads to that cosmetic approach, and and also I've experienced students and I know how they treat things, and they say, "Oh, that's the bird course. That's the one I don't need to worry about, right? I'm going to worry about this calculus, or I'm going to worry about the circuits, or whatever. You know, that's what they focus on. And this one's all that's." Or they complain there's too much reading, too much writing, ain't got no stories, or you name it. There's all kinds of things.
There's always a complaint, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But so I would like to see, you know, Indigenous ways of knowledge and so on integrated throughout. Like that knowledge has to be, you know, that has to be built in throughout. Not oh, this is the one course you do where you check the
Right, you just check the box.
Yeah.
Well, I can tell you about two scholars we have at Granville campus. One is Brittany. She's a doctor of mathematics, and she's Mi'kmaq, and she, I can't say for certain what she does, but her name is Brittany Pittman, and she is able to bring in some Indigenous knowledges into math. I don't know if that works.
Calculus, I think, specifically.
And I think calculus specifically. There's also Avery Velez, and he has developed a standalone course in environmental something or other, Indigenous environmental issues. So again, both in science. So what's that? This is environmental sustainability.
There's also Erica Hurley.
Oh, Erica Ham-Surley. Yes, Mi'kmaq, and she is
Indigenous scholars.
And she actually encourages students to do alternate forms of assessment as well, not writing a paper, but.
Also, I think we have one person online.
Okay.
So we got person in to respond to Dennis's question. Yeah. So Kelly Butler is online. Welcome, Kelly. You want to speak?
Hi there. Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, we're good.
Okay. I just wanted to help respond. First of all, thanking Lynn for her presentation, but also to help respond to your question, Dennis, about, you know, it's difficult to understand, I guess, what each person's role is in all this. And Ivan highlighted how indigenization is led by Indigenous people. But in terms of, you know, even if you can't actualize indigenization yourself as a settler instructor or academic staff member, one of the ways that you can help and contribute to reconciliation is to understand or to kind of create space for challenging the dominant narratives, even if that just means that people are asked to reflect on the things that they presume, the things that we feel are the default positioning. Having ways to have students challenge that in their own thinking. And Lynn talked about implicit bias, you know, a module, I guess, in her class. Like, that's an example where it causes people to think and to challenge their own assumptions about the world. And that's a way that anyone can help contribute. And even if you're not an Indigenous person, or you don't specifically have someone coming into your classroom who is Indigenous, you can do exercises like that, where actually they, you know, like the instructor and the students can be on that journey together of self-reflection, considering your own positionality. When I teach, and of course I'm a Mi'kmaq educator, so I am, you know, bringing in Indigenous lenses similar to Lynn, but I always have an opportunity for students to write a positionality statement, and that's a way for them to actually challenge. And this can be for any field, because everywhere that you work, you're going to be in some type of relationship with Indigenous communities or Indigenous individuals, and it's good to understand who you are in all of that. So I don't even know if that's helpful, but I just wanted to help respond to that question. Thanks so much for letting me speak.
Thank you. And Kay.
Can I just do one last? I know we're going over time, but I gotta say up front that I'm just like speaking off the top of my head, and I acknowledge my own, I say ignorance of this, but very interested in struggling with it myself, because I am, and I guess Kelly just helped, but I think it comes from a little bit of what Dennis was saying too. What does this look like is what I say to myself. So when it's not just a course, or it's not just a chapter in a textbook, and maybe that's some of it, the positionality, and getting students to understand their own kind of positionality in their learning. But it's not integration, is it? Like when you spoke about indigenization and colonization earlier, it's not, is it taking away all of the colonial structures, and is it stripping them all away, or is it a true integration? Is it a replacement? Is it a positionality? And what is it? Like, what is
I'm gonna defer to my friend, Ivan.
Okay.
When we start the decolonization process, it has like 4 factors that I talked about this yesterday at my table. You identify the colonial thing, the negative colonial thing. So Elder Mardina Marshall, who helped create Two-Eyed Seeing with Albert Marshall said, and I'm going to use her exact words. If I'm digging with my hands and a white man brings me a shovel, do I throw the shovel back in his face because he's a white man? Or is that a good idea? So we take good ideas forward. We identify the colonial factors that cause harm, and they cause harm to everyone, not just Indigenous people. And then we challenge them. And then we revise. And if they can't be revised out of being harmful, we replace them. That's the process of decolonizing things.
excellent. Now, I'll just say that, is that hard? From my
Everyone's responsibility.
from my position, to recognize what could be harmful, and I say that honestly.
It usually includes conversations.
Okay.
Because you have to be, like Kelly said, you have to be made aware of the things that you're privileged with from a system that has existed for over 500 years here, that you don't even realize is harming other people's violent privileges you. It's conversation that we should use those things out easily.
Yeah.
It's like we could start with circus, but we would probably start somewhere else. To find the places where that.
But the harmful things is to say that they're embedded in our curriculum?
Oh, absolutely.
They're systemic.
Without a doubt.
Systemic.
Yeah, they're systemic, yeah.